I suspect some of the things I'm going to say have a great deal, have already been spoken about. I'm not going to get into the definitions of poverty, about which I suspect this morning a number of people have discussed. But I do want to say that this organization and the discussions around growth and the discussions around naming something is a function or an outcome of failure. Certainly in Africa, the places where I do my work, it's self-evident that it's an outgrowth or an outcome of failure. So before I get into that, I just want to mention something. One of my TAs is from Togo, and a relative of his was recently was recently attacked in Italy. I don't know how many of you know this, but a great deal of the tomatoes that are picked in central and southern Italy are actually picked by West Africans. There's a long history of Senegalese, of Ghanaians, and now Togolese. And a great deal of this production of food is actually under the auspices of the Neapolitan mafia. Now, those Togolese would not be there if it were not for failure. If it were not for the failure of their states, and if it were not also for a failure of a number of policies that have been about poverty. The most obvious ones, of course, are those in the 1980s and 1990s, and this shift that all of you are familiar with that developed in the 90s and 2000s, which Paul has spoken a great deal about and has written about, the so-called pro-poor policies are a consequence of failure. Right? They're a consequence of previously inadequate policies that were imposed upon various parts of Africa as a laboratory, as well as an ideology around, a prescriptive ideology around what was good for the patient. So I think it's important to name this and to name failure, not just the Millennial Development Goals, but in effect to name the failure of a number of policies, whether they're linked to growth, call it what you want, or whether they're linked to diminishing inequality, or whether they're supposed to be inclusive. All of them have been identified as failures. So to just very quickly, and not to over-determine with too many figures, but numerous countries in Africa, for example, have undergone increasing inequality whilst you've had growth. Some things don't work, and yet new recipes get invented to help the poor. Now, I think what's important, and Mustafa's made an important point about the lack, not so much of legitimacy, which I guess is in some sense the same thing, but rather the purchase that academics have. A number of academics work in institutions that have impact and have effect. They're primarily economists amongst the social scientists. But many others have very little impact or effect. And they have very little impact not just in the institutions that matter, but more so amongst populations that we would also consider to be part of this naming we call the poor. So the Togolese in central and eastern Italy are also part of that group of people called the poor. Now, I think one of the, if I can be prescriptive, and at the end of the day, and I'll do this at the end, in the sense of making connections, but not just making connections because there's a causal connection between one set of failures and people having to make choices or being compelled to make decisions about moving to a given place. That ends them, again, being in relative poverty on the one hand, but also finding multiple forms of oppression which they have to deal with as well. But also making these connections in different kinds of way. One of the areas that I think is interesting is the areas of the people who are our constituency, our immediate constituency, which is our students. If I could just briefly just tell a little bit of, not so much a story, but give you a scenario of, for example, a number of the students that are increasingly coming into, I can't speak to other development studies programs, but I can speak to others. And they come from a wide variety of fields. They're not just people interested in a pet development project or a project that they'd like to do research in a given place. Some students come back from a place they've been, whether it's been through exchange or it's been through some kind of internship from various universities, about which, by the way, there's huge industry, which I think we need to talk about as well. But what's intriguing, and I think it's intriguing in terms of an idea that I want us to take seriously about the broader aspects about how we name and how we define the poor. Not in a way in which they're defined, I think, in the context of policy vis-a-vis the World Bank or the various regional banks, but rather in a broader sense. There are people who, in a sense, think about development in terms of a particular place, a particular location, and what I call their pet project, their pet community, the pet group that they've linked up with. And in some sense that's inevitable, because you have to go to a place to do research, and you have to be in a place to engage a particular kind of local development. So there's that cohort, but there's also another cohort. The other cohort are people who are in refugeeism. And as many of you know here, there are particular agencies that are for development, and there are particular agencies for refugeeism, and they often don't overlap, even though in some sense they're the same problematic and the same set of issues having to do with conflict, having to do with state collapse, having to do with violence, or the different kinds of violence that one can speak to in the context of these broad ranges of issues that I consider to be developmental in some sense. And intriguingly, the third group are actually people who do work on immigration. Many of them chart the, for example, workers, Mexican workers or Jamaican workers, for example, here in Ontario. Some have charted Peruvian workers, for example, here in Canada. So there's a particular interest that different ranges of students have about what they see as a common problem. So if we're going to speak to constituencies, and if people are going to have a voice, the obvious and immediate voice is obviously the students that we speak with and to and whom we teach. The conceit or the concept that I think binds all of these different things and binds the poor in the place that slides from various kinds of stability is what DDFS now calls the humanitarian government, right? He actually called it humanitarian imagination, as well as humanitarian morals as well. And what he's concerned with essentially three things. And one is the problem of reciprocity, which is to say that development and aid are always about the giver receiving on the one hand, but the recipient in a sense being in a position of relative powerlessness. And that has to do with the multiple contexts that they're in. So whether it's a particular development agency providing assistance, or whether it comes through social protection through the state, they become, in a sense, the passive recipients of a form of this, what he calls humanitarian imagination. Now, he's not critiquing it. The point of so much of what he does is actually to look at the various constituencies of poverty, not just in the global south, but also in places like France, in the United States, and we would say here in Canada as well. So in naming poverty, the issue is how do we narrow it? We tend to think of it in a narrow sense of looking at it with respect to development. And the misadventures in development and the misadventures in development policy with respect to a number of policies that all of us know about, and I don't have to talk about except when I go back to my seat in a moment. But rather to widen the lens, and if one is to engage constituencies who can participate, in addition to the kind of constituencies, of course, that are both the subjects and objects of their own development, which Ananya talked about earlier on, are our students and those who are aligned. But one way of doing this is to broaden the lens. And I know that people are concerned with reducing the development institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, and one needs to keep a target upon those institutions, whether you want to reform them, or whether you want to abolish them, or whether you want to find some other alternative. So I think that in some respects we're missing a great deal of how we engage in the sentiments that other people are likely to have about viewing the poor and those who we construct as having poverty. In other sense, they're outside certain kinds of failure, but they're inside other forms of failure. But that's where they overlap. It's not an easy thing to do, because the poor in the global south are often seen as subjects of sympathy, whereas the poor here are often not. And I think there's an important distinction to make. I mean, this is a generalization, but it's a speculative generalization, obviously, but it's one that I would generally stand by. We tend to think here of the poor in terms of welfare recipients. We tend to think of poor people, not us, not the self-selecting people who come to a conference like this, or a workshop like this, but in the mainstream, many people think of the poor as, in a sense, self-inflicted. There's a problem with an inability to make appropriate decisions and choices about lifestyles that they've made. And in light of the resources that are available, they haven't made those appropriate choices. So there's a very different, I think, emotional, and to use Fassin's notion again, imaginary about the poor here in the developed world than there is in other parts of the world. But I think part of the importance of this book, and part of the importance, I think, of this sentiment, which is both a philosophical but it's also an anthropological sentiment, insofar as he's someone who's done fieldwork amongst those people who have been named as the poor in the developed world. And part of what he wants to do, and part of what I would suggest, that not that we reshape or reconfigure the debate about the institutions that set the bar or set the standard for what poverty is in the global south, but rather, like Mustafa, think about this in global terms, where the connections are made between one and the other, so that we see migrants as, in a sense, being pushed not just out of some simple linear choice that they're bound to make, but because of the failed policies elsewhere. But that we also combine those failed policies with an understanding of the conditions of those whom we cast as the poor. So in some sense, it's a call not for a new agenda, but a call for recognition about the sentiments we have about the poor. Thank you.
Okay. First I'd like to thank Nitu and the organizers of this conference for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. And in addition to the projects that Andrea mentioned, I want to be really brazen here and flog my latest book, which is on poverty. It's entitled Social Forces and States, Poverty and Distributional Outcomes in South Korea, Chile, and Mexico. Stanford University Press, everybody go and buy a copy. Particularly after you hear my remarks here, what I think I'm going to do is build on one of the ideas that came out of this book. And I guess I should preface my remarks by saying that I got involved in this project because of my concern for poverty and inequality in Mexico. I wanted to figure out why Mexico was in the mess it was in, and what we needed to do to get Mexico out of it. And I thought, first of all, I'd compare it with Chile, because Chile had reduced poverty, but then I thought, well, a really much better case to try and compare it would be South Korea, because South Korea has a long history of low inequality and very successful poverty reduction. I thought also in this talk I would try to make some connections between the local and the global, since that is the title of the session. So what I'm going to focus on is something called industrial policy, very broadly speaking, i.e. Transformation, productive activities. And I'm going to focus on this because I think that having an industrial policy that produces employment has historically been one of the most successful and best ways of reducing poverty, or at least that's what I learned when I looked at Chile and South Korea. One of the first things that political scientists notice when they start looking at South Korea is the very interventionist and active role of the state from about 1960 right through the 80s and into the 90s. And what we see here is a state that directs in a very explicit way employment-generating economic growth. And it does this in almost a coercive manner. The state owned the banks. It gives credit, it gives loans to those industrialists who will invest in the areas that the Korean government said were important and who will meet the export targets which the government sets for the country. And if you don't do that, if you're an industrialist who took a loan and you don't meet those targets, then you find out that the tax department is busy looking at your books and you can no longer get any loans. And in some cases, Korean businessmen were actually jailed when they didn't do what governments want them to do. So I think there's a really good lesson here. I mean, we obviously don't want to recommend those kinds of coercive activities, but what it suggests here is something that is very counter to what has been the predominant neoliberal thinking for such a very long time, and that is that the state ought to be not in the economy, not picking winners, not doing all of the things that it did in South Korea. So what we saw in South Korea as a consequence of this policy was that employment in manufacturing went from 6.8% in 1960 of the economically active population to 21.7% by 1980. And not only that, the government had a very explicit policy of stimulating forward and backward linkages, and that's really important for employment generation because it means that the employment generation goes beyond the specific industries you target. It expands employment into the industries that feed into that industry and into the industries that purchase the outcomes of those industries you focus on. So that pro-poor employment generating policy resulted in poverty dropping from 41% of households in the mid-1960s to 10% by 1988 in South Korea. So South Korea is arguably a case of rapid poverty reduction through employment generation. Now, it's usually argued that South Korea is not a case where social policy played a very important role. But I think that point of view has missed the broader definition of social policy that we need to employ when looking at a country such as South Korea. Yes, it didn't spend a lot in healthcare, but it did spend quite a bit on education, and it also spent on credit to farmers, on technical support to farmers, on a whole lot of things that one doesn't find in countries of Latin America, or one didn't find historically. And there was also a very important expansion of corporate welfare, where companies gave health care and so forth. And this happened because of government regulations that forced it to happen. Now, as we know from the 1980s, this kind of very interventionist approach really fell into disrepute when we had the rise of neoliberalism. Particularly harmful, of course, were structural adjustment policies, which demanded a rapid reduction of state spending and the removal of state intervention in a whole variety of areas. But I'd also like to draw your attention to the importance of the international realm in this regard, because we also had at approximately the same time the GATT and then later the World Trade Organization. And of course, there is considerable debate about how much latitude countries have right now in industrial policy under World Trade Organization rules. But even if we are able to say there is some wiggle room, I think we have to agree that the latitude for industrial policy is considerably narrower than it was during the heyday of South Korean industrial development. So that we have, for example, TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property rights. We have TRIMS, agreement on trade-related investment measures. We have the general agreement on trade and services and the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. All of these restrict the ability of states to protect and support industry, to foment particular industries, and direct them into export markets if they want to do that. Most of the policy instruments that were used by South Korea in the 60s and 70s are in fact no longer available. So that's what I think is a successful case. Now I'd like to turn to the case of Mexico, which I think is a really good example of the kind of thing that happened during the 70s and into the 80s and the 90s. Mexico followed pretty closely World Bank and IMF prescriptions. It was a little bit resistant at the beginning, but by the 1990s, Mexico was being hailed as a fantastic example of neoliberal restructuring that had been so-called successful. It's widely recognized that the biggest cause of poverty in Mexico is the inability to generate sufficient employment and sufficient well-paid employment. Underdevelopment, the proportion of the economically active population in the informal sector has been estimated by the OECD at about 65% of the economically active population. So there's a real problem with not generating enough employment. You have a situation in which small and medium firms that provide 70% of the employment are paid very low salaries, provide no social protection, and have highly flexible labor regimes which lay off people very frequently. And then you have the big conglomerates that pay higher salaries but really don't supply that many jobs. From the 1980s, the World Bank was strongly supportive of structural adjustment in Mexico, and during that period, Mexico abandoned the few sectorally targeted industrial policies that it actually had in pharmaceuticals and the automotive industry. In fact, what the government did during this early phase of structural adjustment was that it instituted tax relief and incentives for the big conglomerates to get into export markets, which of course didn't help employment at all because the big conglomerates don't provide that many jobs. It's the small and medium firms that actually do. And another important dimension of the Mexican model that was tolerated, if not promoted by the World Bank, included the provision of tax and other incentives for foreign investors to invest in export processing zone, the so-called maquilas in northern Mexico. This was a really bad strategy for alleviating poverty or for any kind of industrial development. The export processing zones came to account for no more than 5% of employment. The export processing zones were characterized by labor precariousness, low wages, and environmental degradation. Moreover, given the separation of production stages, the maquilas involved Mexico in an industrialization process that integrated its productive structure into the U.S. economy and involved it in only a single stage of any given production process, thus contributing to the country's lack of industrial integration. Hence, the maquilas became heavily dependent on imported inputs and failed to stimulate other sectors of the economy. So there was no backward and forward linkages. The maquilas did not stimulate employment in the way that these things are supposed to stimulate employment. But in addition to that, employment in the maquilas actually declined from the 2000s on, as many maquila firms shifted to lower wage areas in Central America, in China. And between 2000 and 2003, the Mexican export processing zones lost 240,000 jobs. So this was not a good employment increasing strategy. Meanwhile, South Korea, since the 1980s, and even since 1987, when after the Asian crisis, when South Korea did begin to move towards market liberalization, it still maintained a commitment to industrial policy and industrial efficiency. And it did some very important things that I truly wish Latin American countries would do. It supported small and medium industries by providing them with credit, providing them with an export fund, even providing some targeted support, providing technological development, and what's quite important is increased investment in research and development. And since the 2008 crisis, South Korea has even strengthened further its support for small and medium industries, targeting some in such a way that it has raised some questions as to whether or not this is amenable to the World Trade Organization rules. Now, Chile is another example, I think, of the importance of an activist and interventionist state in poverty reduction. I don't think Chile's been as successful as Korea, but I think there are some important lessons to be learned here. From the mid-1980s, the Chilean state became increasingly involved in the promotion of non-traditional agricultural exports in salmon, wine, processed vegetables, and so forth. These programs, which continue today, involved activities such as promoting associations of businesses to come together and look for new export markets, and so forth. This activity was very important in generating employment, to such an extent that there was a dramatic decline in poverty in Chile. Between 1987 and the year 2000, poverty declined from 39% to 20% of households. So this was the work that's been done on Chile demonstrates that somewhere between 73 and 80% of this employment, of this poverty reduction, stemmed from these new employment generating activities. The rest of it was social policy. So it seems to me then that the lesson here is state involvement in employment generating activities is really very important. And the international restrictions on industrial policy may leave some space, but it would be so much better if there were more space to engage in effective industrial policy. But I think more important even than a restricted policy space imposed by international organizations is the mindset that has come out of the hegemony of neoliberalism. And I think what that mindset was all about, an important aspect of that mindset, was the delegitimization of an activist state involved in very strongly fomenting industrial development in certain sectors, searching for export markets, and more importantly, becoming very much involved in employment generating activities. And I think that if there's something that academics can do in all this is to really strive towards an alteration of that mindset. I think that mindset is beginning to erode, but I think that the academic community can do a great deal to accelerate that erosion and to encourage the idea that states ought to intervene and states ought to take a role in stimulating productive activities with the aim of poverty reduction.
This morning I was asking a question about our audience, and because it's really interesting. For the first time, at least from my perspective, I see academics getting interested in some of these social troubles. We do get interested, but our track record outside in the view of the public is not very good. Because especially when we are addressing some of these problems towards, or when we are speaking to general public, they are always approaching us with suspicion. And when we are speaking truth to power, we are a little bit puzzled. And sometimes we are as disgenious as if we are talking to the imaginary naked emperor, some of us would be saying, "Your Majesty, this dress shows you in full power," and the others will be going and saying, "Well, you know what? You are naked, you are ugly, you are fat, and you should abdicate." Neither approach really scores us really highly. So I am glad at least, I don't know if we will be talking to our public out of this room, but at least I am glad that we are talking today with each other, and we are trying to hear how we look at the world from our perspective, from our angle, and that's a very important approach. It's a very important thing too. Today I'll be talking about food security, and it's a really highly contested concept. I often find it challenging to explain to people, and then when I read this, it reads like the Lord's Prayer, and it was adopted by the FAO in 1996. It says, Food security refers to an ideal condition that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And each time I feel like saying, amen, you know. And the reason, and there are really about 200 different interpretations of what food security is. And the reason is this is a highly contested concept because it all talks about food provisioning in a market economy where food is a commodity and where access to food is measured in terms of your income, especially if you do not have access to a piece of land to produce your own food to yourself. Okay? In the good old days, a couple of decades ago, and in many parts of the world, there are people with some great difficulties, but there are people who are still producing what they eat. Okay? So the peasants are still there, but those peasants are disappearing very dramatically in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. All the lovely development agencies that we tried to give wonderful advice as academics have been advising to all these countries to cut down rural development and get the peasants out of the countryside. And now, all those peasants came to the cities hungry, looking for food, looking for jobs. There are no jobs, there are no food, and some of us have, at best we can say, well, you know, why don't you try urban agriculture, feed yourself, you know, in the brown fields of the land. So it really, we are part of this game. So we really have to recognize our involvement in this. And we really, if we are capable of finding solutions, and if the peasants will still trust us, maybe we can do something. The ideas, going back to FAO's 1945 ideas, and these are really bright ideas. I mean, they are, and started with genuine interest. And in the post-war era, the whole world had some idea, some commitment that we could actually modernize agriculture. We could solve malnutrition, we could feed the world, and out of that, what we created, a very different system. The reality had very little to do with those ideals of 1945. It resulted in the kind of developmentalism, the kind of growth-oriented, production-oriented, consumer-oriented developmentalism, utilizing more technology, more resources, more fuel, more pesticides, more herbicides, disenfranchise millions and millions of people. And right now we have about 1 billion people, nearly 1 billion people going hungry. Another 1 billion people are going obese. And if this was a zero-sum game, I could just take away some food from the obese people and feed it to the hungry people. Unfortunately, the obese people who are suffering diabetes, like the Nordic people and Aboriginal people in Canada, they are the poor and they are the powerless. They are the consumers of the industrial processed foods, and that's why they are becoming bigger and bigger every day. So we really need to understand this issue. It is not just lack of income. It is lack of access to livelihoods that we destroyed in our best efforts. So, we have a fabulous modern food system. The modern food system is efficient, is productive, is profitable, but it pays more attention to all those lovely things than equity, than sustainability, than health and safety, okay, of people and food. And I won't get into the definitions of what, or the description of what how we define food security, but we do have certain systemic challenges in the food system. Part of them have to do with inequalities, poverty, hunger, gender and racial discrimination. These are parts of the food system problems. Health-related problems such as obesity, chronic disease, epidemics, diabetes, these are other aspects of food problems. Demographic pressures, population density, forced migration, refugees, and refugees from countryside who end up living in the urban areas. These are our demographic problems, demographic pressures we need to address. Climate change, declining resources in terms of land, water, energy, food, fisheries, forests, biodiversity. These are food system problems. So they are not just poverty. So if we are going to focus only on poverty, we are not going to be addressing these complex food system problems. And they are all interrelated, and the solutions are interrelated, and just focusing on poverty will not be very, very convincing. In 1996, the World Declaration, the World Food Summit, we have agreed globally to eradicate hunger in all countries with the target of reducing by half the number of undernourished people by no later than the year 2015. At that time, we had 800 million people going food insecure, and we targeted that we assumed that by 2015 this would be as low as 400 million. I was in Rome in the follow-up World Food Summit follow-up meeting as part of the Canadian delegation as a civil society representative. I was at that time chair of Food Secure Canada, a civil society umbrella organization that represents farmers' organizations, labor unions, and academics too. And at that time, the announcement came in that the 2015 target was unreachable. The new target is 2030, and we are hoping that we will be having the new target is 450 million by 2030, I'll just skip these. But right now, one of our friends and allies from Brazil, Graziano da Silva, he's now the head of FAO, and he has to tell the rest of the world that the bottle is really not all empty. So he had to give the good news, because FAO was not announcing the hunger estimates since 2009. In 2009, they estimated that the number of hungry people exceeded 1 billion people, and then they changed it, they revised it, and they said, sorry, we miscalculated, it's actually 925 million, and then finally they said, okay, the latest figure estimation is 852. I will say that counting hungry is more of an art than science, okay? I wish it was a science. But this is, with all the good news we are just 3 years from the 400 million target, okay? Original 400 million target. And we are, even with the best estimations, it's 852 million. And some people at the UNDP estimate this as 1.2 billion people. Nevertheless, 1 in 8 people are suffering food insecurity. They are hungry, and they are severely hungry. And in some parts of the world, such as sub-Saharan Africa, this is really, the number of hungry, instead of declining, is actually increasing. And the same thing is happening in the Middle East and North Africa. The global triggers. Since 2008, the food prices have been increasing. There are a number of issues, but such as shortfalls in development assistance, failure on implementation of goals adopted at the World Food Summit in 1996, WTO and the failure of the global trade regime in protecting small family farmers and the poor and stopping dumping, armed conflict and state failure, high and volatile growth food prices, biofuels and financial speculation, rise in oil prices, speculation in commodity markets, climate change. These are all food system problems that are considered as serious threats to food security in different parts of the world, in the underdeveloped parts as well as in developed countries. So we really need to understand these. We really need to if we are serious about addressing the Millennium Development Goals and redefining them or looking for alternatives to them. I will talk a couple of the problems a bit more specifically, and then I will talk about some of the potential alternatives very quickly. I'm running out of time. So the biggest problem I identify is the state failure. Okay, and it is not the failure of the welfare state, but the state is failing in many parts of the developing world. We really need to understand this, and this is partly because of armed conflict in many of these parts of the world, and the state, many of these states, local states, are totally dysfunctional. They are unable to respond to people's needs. And if you really would like to understand where you can find hunger, you just need to, and where you can have plenty, you need to look at the map of arms traders. Who are selling arms and who are buying arms will tell you where hunger is most prominent, unfortunately. And if we are really serious, we can maybe go and talk to the big guys and say, stop selling weapons to the developing world, and make arms trade a crime against humanity. And whenever you have hunger, whenever you have armed conflict, you have refugees. Wherever you have refugees, you have diseases such as cholera, whatever. Okay, so they are all interrelated. And I have done some work in Iraq just before the war with some Canadian delegation. We went to Iraq, and if you will look at the results, whether it is sanctions or whether it is armed conflict, depriving people food and depriving people their livelihoods have grave consequences to the lives of people, to the lives of children. These are malnutrition figures that are showing the impacts of the sanctions just before the war, and it got worse. I can show you the data later on. And then when you have regional conflict, state failure, armed conflict, civil war, you have millions of refugees leaving the land, unable to produce, unable to have access to land, and you are talking about serious poverty, serious food insecurity, serious problems. And none of these could happen in Iraq. This is an oil-rich country. This is a country that is exporting oil to the rest of the world, and they are suffering hunger. So I will just talk about as a final conclusion. I will say food insecurity we are dealing with triple crisis: economic, environmental, and political and moral. And our failure to respond to these crises in an effective and timely manner is leading to a global legitimacy crisis, and I am afraid it is far more serious than poverty. When people do not take us seriously, when our constituents do not trust as academics, as economists, as government representatives, as corporate representatives, we are nothing, and we are going towards that. And there are some examples where people are looking for solutions. One is the right to food perspective adopted by the UN, and it is a very effective tool recognizing people's right to food as a basic human civil right. Is an approach you may consider promoting. Another approach is developed recently, a global fund for social protection. This is basically a fund to secure resources for the poorest to replace the welfare programs in these countries. A third approach is adopted by the Canadian Food Security Policy Group, supports smallholder agriculture and rural livelihoods. This morning, several speakers mentioned about the importance of that. Strengthen women's equality. I won't get into the details. Promote resilient communities. Integrate emergency and long-term food security and food sovereignty. Via Campesina and several organizations have been pushing for these. So we really do not need to reinvent the wheel. There are several civil society organizations, several other academics have been proposing solutions. And if we are genuine about our effort to make a difference, we got to talk among ourselves, we got to talk with them, and we have to seek legitimate solutions to get us out of this mess. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to open up the floor to questions now. So questions for the three speakers we just heard, but also if anyone wants to ask questions to Dr. Koc to link this to his earlier discussion, that would be welcome there as well.
Thank you to all the speakers. I have a question for Professor Judith Teichman, first of all. Judith, thanks for your presentation. I was interested to hear you talk about Chile's employment generating strategy, but you talked about the agricultural export sector, and I think that is something that Mexico has also tried to promote, is agricultural exports. So why has that been different in the Chilean case than in the Mexican case?
Good question. I think the difference is in that Chile's strategy was to promote the transformation of agricultural activities, transformation of agriculture. So it wasn't just exporting lumber, it's exporting pulp and paper, it's cultivating salmon, and these kinds of activities, they actually involved some research and development, which was actually started during the Frey years so that they could do it properly. The wine industry, for example, involved research and experimentation, and a lot of people that became involved in these export activities were people that were trained at the university during the 60s and 70s. Mexico's agricultural export strategy, on the other hand, I mean, it's largely huge commercial agricultural farms in the north that export strawberries, export green peppers. There's no transformation, there's no technological development, there's no no research into product development. I don't want to exaggerate, though, the success of the Chilean strategy, because I think it has some real problems. A lot of the jobs that it stimulated were low-paying, precarious jobs. I mean, this needs to be said. But there were some backward and forward linkages that stimulated additional jobs. So, I mean, this is part of the explanation. But I think the good side about the Chilean case is the Chilean government, at least the people that I talked to, seem to be aware of this problem. And so they're trying to figure out a next stage. And I'm not sure about the next stage, whether it's going to actually work, but what they're thinking of is developing high-tech areas linked to their comparative advantage, for example, in mining. So developing a mining equipment industry, developing technologies in food processing, for example. So they are thinking, they want to create better paid jobs than what they've got. So at least they're thinking about it. And I think that the other part of it too is that Mexico has had a long history of using capital-intensive methods and not being at all concerned about job creation, which is, I think, unlike the Chilean case. So there's a whole historical dimension as well.
This is a question for Professor Koc. I was just trying to ask Mina if I was pronouncing your name correctly. That was this program. There was a list of reasons you gave for increasing food insecurity. And it's possible that what I'm saying was there and I overlooked, so forgive me for that.
There's a recent, at least the very recent phenomenon of land grab happening, and this is institutional supported, both within the state supported and the international institution supported land grab going on in Africa. So I was just wondering what your views were on that, and if that was there, then.
That's part of the list. If it was missing, it's just my last minute omission. But it is a serious issue, and in recent years, since the food price crisis in 2008, many countries, food insecure countries like Saudi Arabia or Gulf states, or investing firms that consider investing in land to produce commodities for biofuel and biodiesel, have started investing in large tracts of land in Africa and in Southeast Asia. And these are huge tracts of land. In one case, for example, in 2008, the area involved about 1.2 million hectares of land, practically 1/3 of the island of Madagascar, and it's not a tiny island. And the northern part of the island, so they made an arrangement with the South Korean company Daewoo to produce 1 million hectares of corn as biofuel and as alcohol, and they also aim to clear cut 300,000 hectares of rainforest, tropical rainforest, to produce palm trees to produce biodiesel. And this is happening in Ethiopia, this is happening in many parts of Africa, in Indonesia. So it's a serious issue. The problem is, part of the problem is, a lot of these, especially in countries like Africa, a large section of these lands are not privately owned or tribally owned, so the state can move in and claim this land that used to be accessible to poor peasants. Most of them are poor women. Okay, and now the state goes and claims that land and then rents it for 99 years to companies or to countries that are promising them to give a certain number of fees for having access to this land. And this has environmental consequences, and this has serious developmental consequences and horrendous to the lives of women. One of my students at Dalhousie did some work on the consequences of these land grab deals on the women in sub-Saharan Africa. And unfortunately, these are considered as new initiatives because there is money to make. In land, there is money, and in the long term, this is going to destroy the land. This is going to destroy water resources of the land. This will push millions more people off the land to the cities and worsen the poverty situation and worsen the food security situation. So it's a serious issue. There are multiple issues like that. So I think, yeah, you're addressing a very good point.
Also, this is for all the panel, but just regarding the point that you made, Mr. Koc, so you talked about the proven negative impact of the arms trade on food security around the world. This seems to connect to a larger issue that has to do with this panel, global factors which are actually hindering achieving good governance on the local level. So the question to all the panelists, in addition to arms trade, what would you say are the main global features that are actually creating roadblocks for people who are trying to achieve good governance and social security domestically?
Yeah, I'm a little concerned about the language of governance, because I think it's another one of these trends in development speak, of which we've had many, which often focus obviously upon the countries that in some senses have been the subject of a number of policies. So, I shouldn't need to repeat to people here that good governance came into existence in part because of the claims of the failure of adjustments, right? So you needed the appropriate institutional as well as legal context within which Washington Consensus failures were not being implemented. So I understand why people use the notion of good governance as the need for transparency, the need for the absence of corruption, and the rest of it, and so on. But I would just urge a little bit of caution about that, partly because it was once used as a stick to beat a number of countries with. But all that said, I think there are some real issues. Most of us talked about land deals, not just in Ethiopia and Madagascar, which are two of the more egregious examples, but throughout the continent as a whole. And a lot of this has to do, in the name, ironically, in some places, and Ethiopia is a case in point, of revisiting previous ways of thinking about development, which is a development state. So in the name of past failures, which have to do with adjustment and stabilization policies, there's been a new conceit around the development state, which goes back to places like South Korea, which was part of the language of development in the 60s and early 70s. So land deals most definitely happen because there's a lack of government, there's a lack of democracy. There's an absence of people having inputs into the claims that they can have upon the property that they use. So that's one thing. The other thing, though, is I think that there are global players that have changed the nature of development systems. And Korea has been one, China's another. Brazil, which is often used under the guise of South-to-South cooperation, is a major player in a number of countries, particularly Lusophone countries. In Mozambique, where I was recently, they're a major player in extractive industry. And so earlier on, someone talked about the environment. I think one of the key issues for a number of African countries, which are in some sense poor in a variety of contexts, are rich in terms of resources. So there's a dispositional reason for them to try to utilize those resources. And those resources are being exploited by a variety of countries, not just Korea, Brazil, and to take two examples, and China, but also Canada. Canada is a major player in the resource industry in parts of Africa. So again, if we talk about good governance, we need to bring it home. We need to bring it to places that in fact are engaged in these extractive industries, or engaged in fact in exploitation, and therefore the removal of these populations. So if we talk about good governance, don't impose it as one of these, again, these macro political economy paradigms upon the countries in question, but also look at the governance systems in countries like Canada, which have been hotly behind a lot of the extractive industries in different parts of the world, but most especially in Africa.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. What are the global features we ought to be most concerned about? I'm inclined to give a really flippant response and say greed. That maybe isn't fair, but it does strike me that at bottom, neoliberalism has allowed those driving market forces, corporate interests, and governments linked to corporate interests to run rampant. And if you think about the disintegration of states in some parts of the global south, you can see a worsening during the period of neoliberalism. So I think that the old way of thinking about what constitutes good macroeconomic policy is very intricately linked to some of the problems, many of the problems that have already been identified here. I also have a problem with the word governance. It just kind of makes me shudder because a lot of case of countries are identified as having good or bad governance based on whether or not they have electoral democracies. And I think that we all know enough here to understand that electoral democracy doesn't get you there. In Latin America, it's gotten some poverty issues onto the political agenda, perhaps. But, you know, we all know that we have to go a lot farther than that and have something much more substantive. So I kind of want to avoid that notion and think more in terms of ground-up development that really involves people in the process. And activist governments who listen to people and who pursue policies that actually improve living standards in a sustainable way over the long term.
I can add a couple of other things. One is the WTO and the trade regimes. I mean, we really need to address those issues because it really denies the markets in a fair way for many of the developing nations, especially in the case of food. The other one is the failure of the UN system. The UN, especially the UN Security Council, may need reform, but the current global status quo does not allow the kind of reforms UN needs. Okay, so that many of the problems we are facing globally are related to that one. I can talk about the role of the corporate control. I mean, because many of these corporations have only accountable to their shareholders, but they have no accountability to land, to people where they operate. So this basically allows them to look in terms of their global investment strategies and often avoid, unfortunately, even if they don't want to, they often avoid the local needs in terms of jobs, in terms of environmental issues, in terms of employment developments, whatever. The other thing is that this kind of corporate economy, these are too big. As bureaucratic organizations, they are too big and they are powerful, but they are as efficient as dinosaurs. Okay, and so they are very vulnerable. And sometimes we see the vulnerability of these corporate giants, whether it is in finance or business, when they collapse. Okay, the Lehman Brothers, you know, I mean, nobody could imagine that they would be collapsing so quickly, so fast, and it's just that down. The other problem is that they cannot think long term. They are designed, especially the way we design our economy, they have to think in quarters. So if you show 3 quarters losses, you're out. You know, and that basically destroys sustainability thinking. You cannot think, you cannot simply say, hey, on 10 years, I'm going to lose money in this part of the world, but I am going to clean my business there. You cannot, you will be sacked as a CEO. So it's really, these are some of the problems we really need to address.
We are almost at the end of day 1, and having listened to the deliberations all day, I want to pose a question to the organizers. Perhaps a harsh question, and I hope you'll forgive me for asking this. Just building on the insights from many of the panels today, but particularly from the previous panel, and this is on the idea of the poverty, the struggle for poverty eradication as being a political project. And we know that. And if you ask any anti-poverty activist who is involved in micro settings with poverty eradication, you will get an account of their activity that is heavily political, and they relate, they conceive of poverty eradication as an activity that is related to a larger way of looking at how states and societies and distribution should be organized. And academics, whether or not we recognize the political nature of this, it is lurking very much there behind how we define poverty and how we define our solutions, all those things. So my question is this. Professor Sandbrook gave us 2 ways to see the poverty paradigms. One, the neoliberal paradigm, one, the leftist paradigm. Have ESA thought about how to position itself? And how would you respond to a criticism that there is an element of political ambivalence in how you position yourself? Have you given any thought to this? And do you think it is useful to see the anti-poverty work that's going on around the world from these lenses? And if you think it is useful, is the strategic ambivalence a way to get more impact at the given juncture you are? Thank you.
No, thank you. That is a very challenging question. So let me say this. We're not ambivalent, right? Our name has an important word in it, stand. We take a stand, and we take a stand against poverty. So the reason why we don't frame it as, we are leftists, we are opposing the neoliberal agenda, but rather we are framing this as an academic position against poverty, is that we think that that is where the political legitimacy of an academic movement comes from. But does that mean that it's not political? No. We just start, if you want, we start from a simple moral claim. And we're very simple, an almost banal moral claim. And we seek to build a consensus among those people who accept that moral claim and use their expertise and their rigorous research in order to see what it means in practical terms. And that moral claim is very simple. That global poverty is avoidable and that its persistence is unacceptable. And that every 50,000 people that die a day is not just a disaster, it's a disaster that could have been avoided, and it's simply an abhorrent fact that it's not avoided. That is the very, very simple consensus from which we start. But having said, we don't even have to say that, because any, a person that dedicates their life to do research on poverty thinks that. What we do is take those people, and these are, and that's the profile of the kind of person that's working on the post-MDG agenda in a global level policy. We take these people and ask them, thinking that, what do you know as an expert on what has to be in place on the global level in order to move towards that goal? Eradicating global poverty, putting an end to avoidable death and deprivation. And we want to see if there's a consensus around that. And it turns out that without using names, without using terms like left or progressive, simply using a moral claim and talking to people who have the knowledge, the answer is yes. And we don't need more than that. The politics is already part of the knowledge. And what is that consensus? Well, I can give you a teaser for tomorrow. It's a simple one. It's that there are features that are under the control of the most powerful state agents, which are palpably harming the poor, putting a roadblock to that governance which local governments are always held accountable to, but also simply just harming independently of the question of governance. These features are under the control of the most powerful, and it has to be part of the development agenda to reform those harmful features. First, do no harm. The level beyond that is what that means exactly. And there, we'll go into the details tomorrow, but the easiest consensus is end, stop the policies that make illicit financial flows, that create a loss of $1 trillion, more than $1 trillion a year, that are just spirited away of developing countries. If there are trade quotas that are harming earning in developing countries, end them. If there is dealing with kleptocrats and odious debts, make these illegal. These are the details that come after that basic consensus. So the short summary of my rather long answer is that the politics comes from the moral commitment and from knowing the facts. I hope that's a good answer.
mean, I want to add something to this too. I think it's a really good question about the politics. I think I've been talking to a lot of people in the last few days about, I think something that academics are bad at is political framing. In the sense that, you know, so for example, I'll give an example from the project that we're working on now relating to political participation that I talked about earlier. So I'm working with a number of people who work on democratic theory. There's people on the really empirical side, really people practitioners and normative side. And one thing I think that I want to echo first is just that there is a kind of consensus. I was really surprised actually to find out after talking to like 20 people and having an hour conversation, sometimes arguments, mind you, about the value of this participation and how it actually works in practice. At the end, there were at least some basic things that we did genuinely agree on. And we kind of stayed away from leftist or rightist, you know, framing our tone in that kind of language. But I think even those people who, I think there is a kind of consensus, I guess I want to say, among people with very different views. And in that sense, we avoid some of the politics of it. And I think sometimes what keeps academics from saying something about poverty is we're so afraid, because in our academic lives we spend a lot of time arguing with each other. And so there is a question of, can we reach consensus? And I think at least what's been surprising on my own experience, and I guess Gilead's too, is that there has been a kind of basic consensus about some core things, about whether implementing certain kinds of policies and, you know, beliefs about the values underwriting those things. So I think there's that, but there's still this question later that is going to come to play. Do you frame it as a left or a right thing? It depends to a certain extent. It might depend on who you're talking to a little bit, and that's unfortunate. I mean, and that's the game that academics don't want to play. But we're writing something for the UN, for example. It might not be the best, and I notice now because I just had this comment on some work that I wrote recently that started off with a big critique of the UN. It's very difficult to sort of hand the UN something and say, hey, listen to me while I totally bash you in the beginning, right? So there is some kind of political framing, and I think it would be naive to say that isn't part of the game. And I think maybe because we've been so worried about getting involved in that process, a lot of academics have sort of stood back from this process. So I think you're entirely right. I think there's a political game that's going on, and I think we need to walk into it with eyes wide open and be very careful as we move. But do it in a way with integrity. We should never, you know, sort of politically frame things in a way that we aren't genuinely committed to or grounded in. So I think, but that's a careful line to walk, right? So, you know, I think it's a very important question and one that we're going to continue to grapple with. We're still young. We're only a few years old, but I think this will be a central question to sort of keep in our minds as we move forward.
Just one addition that I would make is that I find the emphasis on moral persuasion. I don't think we can get very far with moral persuasion, because the moral reasons were always there. Well, you know, and so I think we need to frame it in a little stronger language. You know, social citizenship, or seeing some of these things as social rights were talked about. That gets at least me into a more comfortable position. Just my comment.
Sure, that takes us to a different project that we're doing at ASAP that Matt Lindauer talked about, which is about the moral psychology of poverty alleviation. I think that's a really good question. And this is something we don't know all that much about, what actually motivates. From the little bit of work that we've been doing, it turns out moral arguments are efficacious. The kinds of arguments that Thomas Pokey's talking about, where people are concerned about the harm that they're causing and how global poverty is an instance of causing harm, but other kinds of issues just about helping those who are in dire straits. If we present people with these arguments, or those of us who teach these areas, it's amazing how compelling these kind of arguments are. And in many ways, I would actually argue what's missing from a lot of this dialogue is this appeal to moral sentiments. Because I think at the end of the day, it's a feeling of yes, I should obviously help somebody who's in need if it's a little cost to myself. Yes, I should help somebody if I've actually caused or contributed to that bad condition that they're in. So I guess I'm less skeptical, and I think we have at least some beginning empirical evidence to support my non-skeptical position. And I believe there'll be more research in this vein in the future. But I think these are great questions. Thank you.
I was just jumping into this. This is terribly exciting. I think it's terrific that the substantive discussion has led to a fundamental rethinking of the basis on which the organization is existing and the role of moral reasoning in the whole process. And I just wanted to encourage this to go on. And there seems to be a slight tension between taking a rights-based approach to say this is our strongest argument, and a moral sentiment approach saying this is our strongest argument to get there. But the fact of the matter that I think everybody has acknowledged, and that's where the political analysis of it comes into the picture and it becomes inevitable, is that the moral outrage that exists is the outrage against structures that are politically entrenched. So it is challenging the entrenched structures, and in that sense, it is at minimal reformist, maximum revolutionary, in other words, in overthrowing the power structures that are responsible for this type of poverty. I don't think it's possible to conceive of this academic commitment without saying that whether you come from a rights perspective or a moral sentiment perspective, we are challenging existing power structure, we are challenging the status quo, we are against the system as it is. And I think that means that there are many stakeholders that would be uncomfortable with that attitude, and we need to simply accept that and know that very well that's why we're doing it.
Just very quickly before I pass on the mic, so thank you to you, that's exactly what we're doing, and I would say this, despite my answer before, the project and ASAP is absolutely a political strategy. So the first, beyond everything else, beyond self-definition, the first question we ask ourselves is how do we actually get results that will save and improve lives? So what we're trying to come up with is the best strategy, in this case, to just impact the MDGs and make them, post-MDGs and make them what they're supposed to be. And our judgment is that the generation and the leveraging of the authority of academic consensus together with inclusive participation with those whose interests are affected is the best strategy to channel the outrage into political outcomes. So yes, it's all politics.
If I can, I think that, and I do believe in moral sentiments, but part of the burden of my summary talk was about widening. And the naming about poverty is naming a place and people. So in a sense, it's another form of development management, right? You're really saying that the poor, and the vast majority of the poor, by a number of definitions exist in the Global South. But that's part of the problem. The Global South becomes then, once again, a subject of this kind of inequality about where you put your resources. And my point was that we have to understand a wider way in which policies in the Global South and elsewhere also produce poverty in other places as well. And part of that moral lens was precisely to try to understand those relationships. And I think, for me, part of the difficulty is that obviously we go to a place and it's immediate, it's palpable, it's intuitive. And then we can get into to both the explanations and the analysis of why it is that people are the way they are, which are structural, which are local, which have all these factors that I think everyone here is familiar with. But the broad point is if you insist upon making poverty a subject of the South, then you're naming the South in a sense as subjects of something that these structures of power are meant to. And I think I have a difficulty with that, both almost morally, but also I think in some instrumental way as well. So again, this is my take on things, and I don't wish to monopolize a view, but I think I see you referred to, for example, what happens. Or rather, you dramatically said, well, this is what happens to people in this ought to happen. Well, it also ought to happen that people should be laid off in Detroit. It also shouldn't be the case. So, in other words, we can't compare an auto worker with an impoverished peasant in northern Madagascar or in northern Ethiopia. But at the same time, if the poverty discourse is only about the South, then this project comes about the South and nothing else. And the moral sentiment, it seems to me, have to be wider than just the subjugation through poverty in the Global South. And just by the way, one other thing, what would happen if you changed it to be about inequality? I mean, in other words, what would the lens be? How would it be different? If we acknowledge that poverty is fundamentally rooted and embedded in inequalities, what would change if you actually used the language of inequality rather than poverty?
We're glad to.
Huh? Okay.
I don't know. I just want to add something anecdotal, and I'll let everybody respond. But at least when you teach students, poverty jives a lot better than inequality. I don't know why, if it's because people have a moral. I'm only in my second year, so But from my own experience, it's I find that students really gel with the notion of poverty. I myself tend to use the term inequality in my own work more than poverty. But so people are shaking their heads. So let's hear some.
I actually think that inequality is probably just as important. I mean, there's oodles of studies that will show that it's very much linked to high levels of crime and political violence. So that, for example, in Latin American countries, poverty doesn't look too bad in some cases, but there are high levels of inequality and there are very, very serious problems. So, I mean, poverty is one of the features of I think, the global problem that we're concerned with here. And I agree, I wouldn't want to make the discussion just about poverty in the global south, because I mean, my sense of when I read the brochure about what this conference was all about, it's about the North and the institutions that have been involved. And those institutions, international institutions, have been just as destructive to poor populations in the North as they have in the South. And there are certainly people in the global South that have benefited by the recent period of neoliberalism. I mean, Carlos Slim was one of the richest men in the world in Mexico. You know, he's made money leaps and bounds as a consequence of neoliberal restructuring. So I quite agree. I think we have to look at the global situation. We have to look at the way the global economy and the powerful interests in it have operated everywhere.
Yeah, I tend to agree with the panelists. I mean, just imagine, in the name of religion, which is the ultimate moral force, how much violence, how much brutality we have experienced in the history, and we still do. Okay, and I mean, I understand that you know, poverty is immoral, but so is gender inequality, so is racism, and these are not local to the problems in the South. They are universal problems. Okay, I think we need to talk about equality. We need to talk about rights of people everywhere. And you know, I come from the organizing aspect as well, because I mean, we have in our effort to create this national coalition, Food Secure Canada, we agreed on 3 principles: eliminating hunger, sustainable food systems, and healthy and safe foods. And guess what? You know, most people join our organization. Even though those people who are convinced that they consider the hunger unacceptable, they join us because they don't want they are afraid of the obesity epidemic, they are concerned about climate change, and so we realize that mobilizing would, especially in the Canadian context, would take us to speak to the middle class and their concerns. And hunger is the other's problem, and poverty is the other's problem. And unfortunately, and many of these agencies, many of these more powerful groups, when it comes to the other's problem, they ignore that. Just think about, I won't name names, I won't name issues. Think about some most immoral, unacceptable things that had happened and is happening in the 20th century, that our media, our academics, our governments have been completely silenced. Are they immoral people? Why are they silent? I don't know.
Is there anybody else here?
I thought one point that seems to be a consensus at least is, and here it ties in nicely to your reference to religion as a moral compass, an alternative moral compass that, for instance, has been welcomed or championed by particularly these days, I think an interesting parallel being the sustainability movement, and particularly the climate change movement, is that instead of focusing on religion, they focus on science. Instead of focusing on morality in sort of the abstract forms, they try to focus on it in some of its more demonstrable forms. And I think one of the interesting lessons that we keep coming back to, for instance, from Thomas Pogge's lecture, is the emphasis on numbers. So that even if ASAE, or I for inequality, doesn't have the same ring as ASAP, the key message being that the numbers are the problem, and the fact that for a long time academics have been skewing those numbers. So I think there's a recognition that the organization's goal is educational in some ways, which is to change that general understanding of consensus with regard to the numbers, that poverty isn't getting better, that inequality isn't getting better in the ways that I think the majority are explaining it these days. It'll end up moving in the same direction that the climate change debate has, which is towards a greater consensus and perhaps a stronger position.
This is perhaps a minor point, but it has occurred to me in the course of the day's discussion that since part of the agenda is to reflect on beyond 2015, one of the points that your remark reminds me of is that the Secretary General went into Rio Plus 20 with a firm commitment to replacing MDGs by SDGs, and this needs to be at least discussed if an alternative is going to be found, because Sustainable Development Goals is on the agenda as a possible alternative. I think there may be better ones, and I think that the title of the organization suggests an approach that is open-ended and is not going to simply fill in new blanks of, instead of 8 objectives, there will be 15, and instead of calling them development goals, there will be sustainable development, Millennium Development Goals, there will be sustainable development goals. That's obviously, we could do better than that, and I think it is the role of academic institutions to think more deeply than that. I think you have a point to make on that. But I was surprised nobody mentioned SDGs, which was a big issue at the eve of Rio Plus 20.
This is a fascinating point. Last weekend, I spent 2 days with the Stakeholder Forum and a conference on the SDGs. And it's not, you shouldn't be, but what I've learned is that you should not be surprised if you haven't heard a word about the SDGs. So what's going on? The Sustainable Development Goals is an alternative approach to what should replace, what should come after 2015, which is more universal, and actually I think reflects many of the thoughts expressed by the panelists. That we should think of development, first of all, as a universal issue that has to do with the planet, has to do with the human ecosystem as a whole, rather than the addressing of severe challenges at the bottom of the inequality distribution. This is a completely different philosophy and approach, and what's going on is that the two processes are going ahead in a complete silo. So no one talks, really, no one writing about the MDGs reads what the post-MDG people are doing and vice versa, and it's not an accident. Now, Ban Ki-moon committed, and he reaffirmed it, I think, in the end of last week, that there will be one process going ahead. This is, I think, the third time, and the high-level panel of the MDGs, the president of Liberia recently reasserted that there will not be two processes. Somehow, the universal approach and the poverty-focused approach are going to be merged into one agenda. And that's a good thing. And I think that we too, as people who come to want to just, we grew up in the poverty and development camp, need to see how to think about it in a more integrated way. And in the end, what should come after 2015 has to deal with problems which are universal, which are shared by people from various stratas of society in all countries. The problem is no one knows how to do it, and nobody's talking to each other in the two camps. So a little bit of news here. We've been, the Stakeholder Forum gave through ASAP a challenge. That look, if you can put together a team of thinkers that represents the SDG thinking and the post-MDG thinking, and try to come up with first principles. So shared philosophy on which we can start building the details for a post-2015 agenda, which focuses both on sustainable development and on poverty and severe deprivation reduction. That might be a game changer. So this is something that we're trying to do, and we're trying to do hopefully very, very soon, so that this type of thinking can be shared with the principles involved well before the September UN General Assembly meeting on the post-2015 framework.
want to go, but I just wanted to maybe share my skepticism of this process, and I was just invited by a random email that came into my inbox a few days ago, and I happened to be on sabbatical. And what piqued my interest was the fact that I have been, during this time, looking at the MDGs through sort of I guess, a feminist political economy lens, particularly at the ones that are related to gender. And there's a lot of research out there that really points to the MDGs as in a sense, as a codification of gender inequality, of structural gender inequality, that the way that they have been designed, the measures that are used to account for women's empowerment or what have you, are selective, are narrow, and that if you look at the time, from the beginning of the institutionalization of the MDGs to now, what have you seen? You've really seen in many places a very significant rollback in terms of how we understand, particularly sexual and reproductive justice. You've seen the further invisibilization or siloization of reproduction, social reproduction, in considerations of inequality within the global economy. You've seen hostility towards feminist perspectives. You've seen this in academia as well as in the UN galaxy. And I guess what I'm saying is that there seems to be some kind of a consensus here that somehow the MDGs are intrinsically good, that maybe we can just fix them, or some of them are perhaps problematic, and we have to come up with, again, what's going to be new about this? It seems to be the same players, it seems to be the same institutions. And there doesn't seem to be much of an auto-critique involved in terms of how we're teaching students as well. One thing that I've also noticed teaching in the last decade is, again, students will embrace poverty, but they won't embrace inequality. That students seem more interested in branding themselves as activist, as progressive, that they've embraced market mechanisms such as social media and philanthropic solutions, Product Red, for example, the Me Too We phenomenon, celebrity worship of, and so it's this whole sort of interesting shift that's gone on, I guess, that started with the advent of neoliberalism. And I don't know if we've gone far enough, I don't know if we've gone far enough in actually looking more deeply at these kinds of questions and these issues, and enough to actually come up even with first principles, and even thinking about the utility of developing first principles in order to come up with something to replace the MDGs. And perhaps we should be doing something else as a group of really concerned and politicized academics, and maybe paying much more attention to those social movements on the ground. The social movement, for example, a good example is what Anyana Mukherjee was talking about. There's all sorts of solutions that are being designed by people at local levels all over the world that we don't know about, that students don't know about, that probably could use a little bit of our support and our exposure, and perhaps we're not the ones that are going to come up with the solutions.
I would wish that we would think about a paradigm shift. We are really in this particular point in history. We know that we think this paradigm shift is important, but as academics, we cannot propose anything. But as academics, we can study alternative models? What are the alternative paradigms that are actually going to take us through the 21st century in a peaceful, sustainable way, in an equitable way? What are some of the alternative practices emerging in Brazil, in Kerala? You know, what are they? What are some models, best models? For example, we look at some food security initiatives happening in different parts of the world, and what lessons we can learn, how can we translate this information to others who can use this, and what are some of the alternative ways of organizing, new forms of mobilizing for change. So I think we can do those things, and I hope, because if we are only addressing 2015 right now, we have a shelf life of 3 years, and and I have been around this before in early 1990s, and we organized, and we had several consultations before 1996. We had several consultations as we were writing Canada's action plan in 1998. Nobody even knows on which website it exists anymore. Nobody ever read it again. We organized before Food Summit 5 years later, and all of that just disappeared. So what I think we should, if we really like to bring all academics together to think for the future of the world, we may need to sit down and look at these alternatives. This is one way of approaching it.
I think probably the best strategy is to recognize that what we're doing here is the beginning of something that we don't know what the end is going to be. So probably some of us are thinking that, well, you know, I don't hear anything that's radical enough. We need so many fundamental changes. I don't hear that being discussed. But I think this is a process, and in that process, you get discussion going, and you move the thinking. Think for a moment what happened under neoliberalism. That was a paradigm shift of enormous proportions. And that started with intellectuals, quote unquote, talking about economies and what needed to happen for them to be fixed. And it precipitated a total wholesale revamping of how economic policy was conceived of. I think our task is to undo that and to try and figure out what will work. And I really believe the more I have investigated issues of poverty and inequality, that these issues are very contextual, that there is no quick fix for particular countries, that what works in Kerala is not going to work in Mexico for very important historical, cultural reasons. So poverty and inequality solutions are multidimensional and contextual, and I think that as a group, our task is to think about and find rationales for the fundamental importance of addressing these kinds of questions, and to figure out strategically what is the best way to approach these kinds of questions, to appeal to the largest number of people to get on board and support a change in thinking. We can't just talk with each other. We need to have widespread public support both in the North and the South, and we've got to figure out a way to do that. I don't think we're going to do it by saying, you know, the way we need to fix poverty in Mexico is to have more employment generating growth. That isn't going to appeal to most people. That is a discussion of what would be the ingredients of poverty reduction in a particular context. What are the various facets of poverty reduction that may belong to the mix? So I would say not to get discouraged if you don't think things are radical enough, because this is just the beginning of a process.
I'm kind of halfway between both those approaches, I suppose. But I would say, I mean, you know, we often talk about donor fatigue. I think sometimes we also get you know, fatigue from letters. You know, so we go from the MPGs to the And I just wonder, and there, in a sense, there are different audiences. I think Judith is absolutely right about this. That we have academic audiences, and we have our students, hopefully not as propagandists, but have pedagogists. Pedagogy. So you talk about inequality, for example. It all depends. It all depends how you locate and situate a discussion about poverty. A lot of our students do come to this out of a sense of a disposition of moral weeping about the desperate states of millions of people throughout the world, and this experience that they've had. But at the same time, they're looking and searching for the reasons why. And a lot of it is institutional, has to do with the big institutions that supposedly enhance and further this process, but it's also about structural things in society as well. So without being propagandistic, you can also pedagogically point out the iterations and the relationships between things that are there for anyone to see. It's not hard science, it's difficult science, because it's social science, but it's nonetheless something that can be done. The second issue for me is the issue of the issue of audiences. It's a related issue, I should say, of audiences. There are multiple constituencies, one of which are people here, who I would imagine would be self-selecting. And obviously there are they're believers at some level. The wider lens, though, are the kinds of situations which Mustafa is talking about, to give this real, a real thrust. So if you've got principles, the question is, who are the stakeholders you refer to? Is it a narrow set of constituencies of 50% of the population have a certain kind of education, or is it the wider constituencies, all of whom are in the same circumstances of precariousness, or in the same circumstances of being unsure about their futures? And it seems to me that's part of the job as well. It's not only about the university constituencies that you're likely to find a hub of people whom you can always rely upon to feel morally disposed about those who are the least best off or the worst off. But it seems to me, again, both strategically as well as I think morally, there's an imperative to try to widen the constituencies, because those constituencies, in some sense, are also dealing with the legacy of neoliberalism. We can speak about Canada, we can speak about the United States, we can speak about various parts of Europe, as well as we can speak about the kind of rough, rude, and horrible inequalities that have been introduced through neoliberalism.
Of course, we can go on like this, and we will go on. But let's see if I can be brief here. I appreciate very much Judith's reference to the strategic thinking on this. And one of the thoughts that occurs to me on this thinking strategically on it is that the particular project of Beyond 2015, I don't think we should delude ourselves, is a top-down process. The process of engaging in a dialogue with our fellow academics and our students, and with practitioners, and with grassroots organizations functioning around the world, is the long-term strategic process of changing mind. With this particular one, with Helen Sirleaf, Johnson Sirleaf, and Cameron, and so on, in a very short time frame, is very much a top-down. So for that particular top-down strategy, I have two tactical suggestions to make. Because we agree that, and your point is very well taken, that MDGs or SDGs have many defects in them. I find two frameworks that can introduce, let's call it our progressive agenda, into a top-down approach. Because consider whom you're working with. These people have to deal with, Ban Ki-moon, you have to deal with senior people of this type. It calls itself a high-level bank. We're definitely in a top-down process. So the two of eminent people, so what more do you ask for? It's all in the title. So two ways in which I think we might be able to introduce concepts and ideas that are useful are, one, the global development agenda, which is an extraordinary thing that I discovered quite by accident that DESA has produced, condensing some smart person, I don't know who the hell it was, some smart person in DESA, condensed all of the summits and conferences into a global development agenda that has everything you want to pick and choose from, but good ideas in it. Secondly, that hasn't been mentioned at all, and we are speaking at a conference that's been brought together by by Me Too, the concept of the right to development. The right to development has widespread support. It's in a political stalemate for complex reasons, and if your father had been here, we might not be in this political stalemate that we're in. He tried very hard. So those two ideas might be helpful in the top-down approach. The global development agenda and the right to development, because of the broad support you've got for it, but the underlying commitment to social justice and rethinking the global political economy.
Thank you very much, and I have to say I'm very happy to end both on the note of very good practical strategic suggestions and on the skeptical note. And before I pass on to Mitu for the second part of the wrap-up, just an interesting reflection on the skepticism, which obviously, we are aware of and we're worried about ourselves. The first thing to note, and this makes me most happy, is that it turns out that we're not such a self-selecting group. So if every one of the panelists would have come and said, this is the best thing since sliced bread, I might be a bit worried that our self-selection is too bad. So further self-selection, but we see at least that it's not complete. And that's a good thing. And the second reflection is that despite the skepticism and disagreement, this is another interesting case where a few steps beyond it, we see that actually when it comes to action, there is a common ground to share. And I'm sorry, I just don't know your name? Colleen. So this is really, and that common ground can, I think, be expressed in the response to Colleen. So what I would say to Colleen is, don't quote me on this, but I also sometimes wonder about whether we can get, with all the political limitations, are really useful replacements for the MDG. I also doubt that. I'm also skeptical. And if I were to be asked what should we, all academics interested in impact, should do, would I say that all of us should spend all of our resources on the post-2015 agenda? Of course not. We should be working on the many things that matter. A lot of them are local on the national level. A lot of them are local on the village level, like the excellent work done by people like Team Carlin and the people at JPAL doing RCTs. There are many things that academics need to do. One of those things that at least some of us ought to do is to make sure that our voices are heard in the next 11 months in which the post-MDGs are shaped. And that's, I guess, one thing that I'm willing to say without a shred of doubt, that some of us need to make sure that this time around, even if we're skeptical, we don't stay out of the process. And I look forward to tomorrow, and we'll strategize together on how to do that effectively. Thank you very much.